Hi, I'm Phil Noble with Envision, South Carolina, and we're here in the University Center in Greenville talking with Hayne Hipp, one of the premier business leaders and civic leaders in this state, not only in his lifetime, but in his family has been leaders throughout this state for years. Welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Delighted to be here, Phil.
Talk a little bit about, as you were growing up, your sense of South Carolina as having a different identity, of being not just like every place else. What about South Carolina in your early years had an impact on you about us being different?
The state was significantly different than it is from now, and you'll hear people refer to, what about the good old days when we had leaders that could do something? And the leaders that were in power at that point made significant changes. But that isn't the way it is today. They were just not diverse in terms of race, certainly in terms of gender. It was a much smaller, less complicated state. The political power was centralized very tightly. And I think as we have moved into competition across the country and competition worldwide, we are adjusting to that, but it does take a different set of skills and a different approach.
What, within the context of South Carolina history and culture, what are our assets and what are our liabilities in terms of living, dealing, being competitive in that new world?
Well, our assets are our people. Their positive attitude, their approach to life, their appreciation for where they are, the opportunities that they see. Our liabilities are mostly the creation of our own minds. There's some technical things that we need to deal with, but I don't think there's anything significantly holding us back.
You think our people are significantly, qualitatively different than Mississippi or Texas or California?
Well, those are three different, that's an apple and an orange and a banana. Yes, I do think, because South Carolina is not a state, it's really a community, and it's a relatively small one at that. We can reach decisions individually and collectively, and we can do something about them quickly, as opposed to time-consuming in California when you look at that size, or Mississippi with the liabilities they have on the educational front, on the racial front, just basically a poor economy. On Texas, which is split right down the middle between hardcore, rigid approaches on the liberal side, hardcore, rigid approaches on the conservative side. We're not burdened with those superficial distractions.
That's really interesting, the notion of linking our relatively small size with the ability to act quickly. Where have we done that? Where have we in South Carolina's history done that?
Well, you go back to the Education Improvement Act with Dick Riley. Yeah. That was quick. They would still be debating that in California. That never would have made it to the table in Texas and Mississippi. That was a game changer.
Why did that succeed? Why? I mean, Governor Riley, we're going to talk to him later today. I mean, he's very much an upstate product. Why was he able to do it? Why did it succeed?
Because I think there was communications across the state. All of the decision makers sat down and talked. And I don't mean the top 5 corporate chiefs or the top 5 political heads or the top 5 nonprofits. I think there was a broad-based discussion around the state in all the communities. And everyone said, yeah, we need to do something about that. And let's step up and let's make a difference.
Do you see an issue or other social ideas that are now ripe for that kind of community action in South Carolina today?
Well, I think the challenge that South Carolina has right now is that we don't slip into the negatives I talked about in the other states, that we don't slip into a we versus them, because that really slows down the progress, slows down the momentum. If you can't build a coalition with the majority of the people believing in, supporting, participating, understanding what you're doing, then you're not going to get buy-in and you're not going to get any progress. You may have a single victory here or there, but you leave too many wounded or uninterested or angry participants on the sidelines, and there's no progress. That's what we can't afford to do.
Talk about the geographic divides and the racial divide, which to me are the two biggest divides in this state. How do we overcome the geographic upstate, middle, and low country PD mentality?
Well, let's look at it from a broader point of view. And you go back and look at the history of the state, and you talk with those who were in leadership positions in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whenever it is. South Carolina still, to a degree, is dealing with what I would call the silos of arrogance. And they have held this state back for too many generations, and I think we're beginning to address those. Those silos would be race, they would be politics, conservative versus liberal, or Democrat versus Republican. They would be urban versus rural. They would be religion. They would be upstate versus lower state. And if we push our way through those and become more inclusive and build that coalition and address those silos of arrogance that have held this state back for so many generations, that's when we will have a very significant breakthrough.
Who's supposed to articulate those issues that we will work on? Who is and should be the driver of those?
You can articulate those. I can articulate those. The politicians can articulate those. The corporate heads can articulate those. The nonprofits, the significant players in the African American community. I just left a symposium, Athena, which is a women's group here who are building a strong base. They can articulate those. We need to be having a dialogue on that. And coming out of that dialogue are several what I would call technical issues that could be addressed, that could move the state forward.
For example, the technical issues.
For example, at some point, and these are what I would call policy wonk issues. They are not big, broad, sweeping generalities, but if we address those, they clear out a lot of clutter. They even the playing field. Two that come to mind would be when you're running a family, or you're running a company, or you're running a city, or you're running a state, you need to have a balance of power. All the parties need to be represented. When you go back and look at South Carolina's Constitution, all of the power is centralized in one single area. And as long as that is there, then we're not going to move forward. You need to have power diffused in the legislature, in the House, and in the Senate, in the governor's office, in the judicial branch. And so we need to take a look at our Constitution. Now, for that to happen, it's going to take a very bold move. That means that those who have 100% of the power are going to have to step back and say, I can be comfortable with 80%, I can be comfortable with 70%, I can be comfortable with 60%, not asking for 49%, but if I can step forward and say the state will be better off with a balance of power, we make great progress. So we do need a constitutional conference. We do need a revision in the Constitution. And if there were a way, a magic way, that it could be done non-politically, that it could be done for the benefit of the citizens of South Carolina, could be done so that South Carolina could move forward, could compete against North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, others in the United States, and others around the world, that's what is bold. But it's just a small technical issue.
You're talking about the relative concentration of power and being a legislative state, and that being...
But it's not, we shouldn't pick on the legislature. The same thing could be if all the power were concentrated in the governor's office.
Correct.
If all the power were concentrated in the judicial system, or if the corporations here in the state had all the power.
Right.
So it's just a concentration of power, period.
Right.
And to move forward, those in power have got to give up just a little bit of power.
given that, and again, not making a value judgment about the legislature versus those other power centers.
You can't do that because that becomes a distraction and a personality issue.
I understand. But if the problem is the concentration of power, and part of what you're seeing out here is an outcry about ethics and the bad side of the concentration of power corrupting and becoming arrogant, is your arrogant silos, etc. Are we worse off than other states because we have had that concentration in power? I mean, are we more corrupt than other states? Are we less able to adapt and change than other states because of that, quote, corruption of power?
Well, first of all, I think that's an irrelevant question because we're not talking about corruption. And are we more or less corrupt than other states? And I'm not saying that concentration of power in the legislature is a corrupting influence. What I'm saying is we don't have a balance. Will corruption go away if we have more of a balance? I don't think so. It may not be as prevalent. I'm not sure that we are more corrupt or less corrupt or more ethical or less ethical. Those are personality, those are societal issues. They're going to always be there. What I'm talking about is just having a more balanced approach to dealing with the challenges, primarily economic development, primarily education in this state.
I was having a conversation with Dana Beach, who you know.
Yes.
And their group has gotten into this ethics fight. And his premise is that we can't do what we need to do in the environment, parentheses, or education or anything else until we first fix this corruption ethics issue, functional, operational issue within state government. Do you think that's true?
Well,
or do you think that's a distraction?
I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's an issue that needs to be dealt with. I don't know if we're any more or less corrupt, as I said earlier, than other states. And yes, we should deal with it, but you could have all of the corruption in the governor's office. You could have all of the corruption in the judicial system. Corruption is corruption. We still come back to the issue of we need a balance of power. If there were a balance of power and the governor had more power or the judicial had more power, would they clean up corruption? I don't know, but we're never going to find out. I'm thinking primarily in terms of economic development, education. Those are the two driving tools that need to be addressed so that the citizens of South Carolina have the opportunity to make a decent living, to raise a family, to run a profitable business.
Well, let's talk about those two, economic development and education. It's an article of faith, if you will, that we can't have economic development without improving our education system, that's a key to it. If that's the case, and I accept it is, why is it that we still get the BMWs, we still get Boeing, we still get the growth up the I-85 corridor? Why haven't we seen the pain? We seem to be still doing okay.
Yeah, well, because we're South Carolinians. Now, let me answer that.
Wait a minute, you got to explain that.
Okay, let me answer that in a serious way. Greenville happens to be Spartanburg, Anderson, the I-85 corridor. Historically has been pro-business, has aggressively recruited. Part of its success is that there has always, at least in my lifetime, been a collaboration between the government entities, whether it's county council, a city council, or a regional body, and the business people, and the people in the communities who are active. So there has been a real working relationship, and you can see that in the civic improvements in the communities, whether it's the Fine Arts Center or the Peace Center, or you can see it when Michelin, BMW, GE come into town. They sit down with everyone in the community, and everyone says, we want you here. You go look at Southwest Airlines, and you look at the group from the upper part of the state who went out to visit with them and said, here's why we want you here. They know how to sell, they know how to market, and they understand that value. Charleston does to some degree. Columbia does to less degree, but is at least aware of it. When you talk about we're doing fine, you're talking about small areas in the state. We're still plagued with the corridor of shame.
Right.
You can step outside of Greenville 30 or 40 miles and you can find ample poverty, ample lack of opportunity. So we can't say we're doing fine until you can include more people than are presently being included.
Will our current trajectory in education get to the point where the BMWs and the Michelins and everybody else says, no, sorry guys, I'm not coming to South Carolina, I'm going to someplace else?
No, I think that's a real risk. And you
are we there now?
I don't think we're there. Well, I don't know because I'm no longer in economic recruiting. I would say subjectively that South Carolina is at a tipping point. And if we don't address some of the issues, one being the balance of power, two being the tax system, if we don't address those, we run the risk of tipping into what you would call the Mississippi, Alabama. Or we run the risk, or the positive side, of effectively continuing to compete with Charlotte, Raleigh, Atlanta, and the rest of the country. So to me, we're at a crossroads. We've probably been there for 3 or 4 years. I think Boeing maybe gave us a sense of security, could have been a false sense of security. But where we're interviewing here today, we're right in the middle of Greenville Tech, upstate. And when you talk to the professors here and you talk to those that are involved, it's clear that Jason Primo, who runs a small manufacturing company, very, very significant player, he can't get people to work there because they're not trained. When you talk to those who are active here, they're spending something like $22 to $23 million on remedial studies. These are people that come here to learn how to be a machinist, but their mathematical and their communication, their English skills are so weak. So it gets back to, we're going to have to address the relatively weak product that our public education system is turning out.
If Greenville is, and I think it's a fact, it's not an opinion, that Greenville has been the most effective in bringing that community together and having a common voice with some common vision, which has resulted in this economic, relatively speaking, boom that compared to the rest of the state. You know, I've always said the most effective force in this state, progressive ideas, is the Greenville business community. My question is, how do we leverage that across the state? How do we get people from Greenville to go east of Simpsonville?
Yeah.
And
good question.
And impact the corridor of shame, impact Allendale?
Well, you have to recognize that the Greenville business community has significantly changed over the last 50 years. If you go back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, or let's go back to the teens and 20s, and we were sharecropping cotton. Then we began to build our businesses, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you had domestic-based companies here. Domestic-based companies are companies, by their nature, their excess profits after employees are paid, products are delivered, et cetera, are reinvested in the community. So you had J.P. Stevens, Dan River, textile companies reinvesting into the community. You had South Carolina National Bank, you had Bankers Trust reinvesting in the community. Right. You had Liberty Life, you had Colonial Life reinvesting into the community. You had Daniel Construction reinvesting into the community. Then for a number of reasons, in the 80s and 90s, those companies either became obsolete and disappeared, textile, they got into trouble, engineering firms, or they decided it was time to consolidate, or others decided to consolidate, banks, insurance companies, so that South Carolina doesn't have its homegrown base of domestic companies. And that's the change in the leadership. Michelin is a significant player in the community. BMW is a significant player in this community. GE is a significant player in this community. But today, the excess profits earned by South Carolinians producing those superb products, those excess profits go back to Claremont, they go back to Schenectady. So we need to continue to recruit those non-domestic companies here because they are great employers. But we need to focus in on building and rebuilding domestic-based companies so that the excess profits are reinvested back home, home being South Carolina. And you have to have a balance in there. You can't ignore one. If you spend all your time recruiting BMWs, then you ignore your domestic base. If you focus just on your domestic base, then you miss out on the wonderful opportunity that a Michelin brings. So it's a balance.
Well, that leadership in the 40s and 50s and 60s that developed the South Carolina homegrown businesses, if you will, they cared about the state. They had a vision for all of South Carolina. Whether or not everybody agreed with it is irrelevant. The point is that they cared. They were involved. You know, I don't see the BMW leadership, not to pick on them or any of these guys, being engaged in state issues, being engaged in a broader vision of the state other than, you know, they came here from Indiana, they're going to leave and go to New York.
Right. Well, I think they're not as engaged as the leaders were in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, but they are engaged. Michelin is very active in the community. GE is active. BMW is active. I look at the Liberty Fellowship program that we've talked, and we have people have been nominated from those companies. They're active. They care. And in fact, I think one of the wonderful things is that when someone comes here from GE and they've been here 10 to 15 years and they get the word, well, it's time for you to go back to Schenectady, then someone says, you know, I really like South Carolina. I think I'm going to open up a business here. So there is that little added benefit.
Interesting. Let's talk about Liberty Fellows program then.
Liberty Fellowship.
Liberty Fellowship. You obviously spent a long time thinking about what you could do after you sold the companies, et cetera. And what was your thought process of trying to figure out how you could have an impact? And why did you decide on the Fellows program? Why did you focus on leadership?
Well, it was a series of positives and negatives. Positive, Anna Kate, my wife, and I have been extraordinarily fortunate and lucky to be here in South Carolina. We've benefited greatly. We've had a great family, had a great business, and we love where we are. We see the strengths and we see the weaknesses. So that is the positive. On the negative, it was a recognition that the issues that we've talked about, that if we didn't begin to make a change, if we continued to hold on to the status quo, we weren't going to get there. We were going to tip over. So we said, what, with how we've been blessed, what could our payback be? Where could our participation to make sure that we began to address these issues? And we said, well, should we be doing it? I mean, who's going to be listening to us now? So we decided that we would invest directly into the bloodstream of this state, directly into the young leaders of this state who have the potential to make that change. This is a long-term investment. This isn't you do 50 push-ups and we're going to measure your arms. This is a 10, 20-year investment, basically bringing together the young leaders with a diversity of perspectives, with a wide range of thought, giving them the opportunity, the platform to sit down on a very concentrated basis in 4 seminars, 5 days each, and they start off with the classics, Aristotle, Socrates, they move to Locke, Hobbes, they move to Martin Luther King's Birmingham jail letter, they do some poetry, they do a play, they do some music, but during that period they have the opportunity to listen to other perspectives. Someone from the upper part of the state, lower part of the state. Someone who is a rigid liberal or conservative has that opportunity to hear another point of view. An African American is in very close proximity with a Caucasian. So all those artificial barriers, all those silos of arrogance that you and I just talked about, all of those begin to break down, and they begin to say, another person's perspective absolutely has merit. What can we do individually and collectively on a collaborative basis to address the issues, the challenges that South Carolina has? You can't apply for Liberty Fellowship, you have to be nominated. And so the Liberty Fellows are only good as the nominations that come in. Those nominations are only as good as those who are doing the nominating, and that's everybody in South Carolina. So we're asking everybody in South Carolina to look around and nominate someone for the Liberty Fellowship program. What should they look for? We're looking for individuals between age 30 and 45. We are looking, and you're tired of hearing this, a diversity of perspectives and a wide range of thought. We build a mosaic. As Ben Dunlap, president at Wofford, said, you can't have a world-class symphony with the 20 best flutists in the world. So we're looking to build that mosaic, that well-rounded band. We're looking for people who are successful in their own right. This is not a leadership development program. They are already in a leadership position, although we work closely with the Diversity Institute at Furman, with Leadership South Carolina, and the other leadership programs. We are looking for those who actively participate in the community. There are a lot of people who go to work, do their job, come home, go behind their gate, go to their kid's soccer game, and that's it. That's fine. But we are looking for people who say, I've got an obligation, I understand the just society, my obligation to participate, to give back, to work with other South Carolinians to make South Carolina a better place for all South Carolinians. And we're looking for those who are or have the potential to have an impact at the state level. What do we look like now? As I said, they're 185. Average age is 41, probably 55% male, 45% female, about 30% African American. They come primarily from the business world. We recruit, maybe not consciously, but at least subconsciously, 70 to 75% from the business world. The rest from nonprofits, politicians, judicial. They are scattered all over the state. Greenville, Spartanburg, Columbia, Charleston, obviously, Hilton Head, Beaufort, Florence, Darlington. We have weak representation in Horry County and the Myrtle Beach area. Shane Massey, who's in the Senate, is the only one from Aiken. So we have two now from Orangeburg. So we are reaching out everywhere we can. Great website, everything is on there. And again, I urge people to join. We did a study, and each of the fellows has a mentor from the senior business leadership. And they each have to do a project in their first 2 years that has the potential to have an impact at the state level. After those seminars, then they move into one of the forums. And when we did our study, we found the projects fell in 5 areas: public policy, education, economic development, environment, and health. Thank you. You know it better than I do. So each of the fellows selected into one of those forums. We had the research universities do research on specific topics. For instance, recruiting businesses into South Carolina. What's North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, what's the rest of the world doing? How are we doing, where we're weak and where we're strong. The forums are open to everybody, so now the forums are probably half Liberty Fellows, half South Carolinians. So we are trying to build a platform where we can address the issues. Public policy is dealing with the issue of Constitution. Address the issues that you and I are talking about that are holding us back. Addressing those silos of arrogance, if you can forgive me for being repetitive.
And you're obviously happy with where it is.
I don't know how you define happiness. I feel extraordinarily positive, because when you have the chance to meet with, talk with these young people, they don't know they can't get it done. Right. They don't know that they're beating their head against the wall and nothing's going to ever happen. And because they don't know that, it's going to happen. Right. It's going to change. And they have communications across the state with people not similar to them in race, religion, color, whatever you want to be, but who have a passion and an understanding of South Carolina and what they can do about it. The expansion of the program to the 5 forums, the 2 summits that we have had, that has begun to build a communications network of understanding across the state, where we've had several thousand people. So all we have done is create a platform where we can come together and have discussions, sensitive discussions, and learn other perspectives and get a chance to say, this is why I believe in this. This is why I believe in whatever that topic is. And then they hear, well, wait a minute, let me ask you about this. Well, you know, that's a good point. So that's what's exciting about it.
The leaders that are coming out of Liberty Fellows, what is the quality that you're trying to nurture, and what is working with those guys?
Well, leadership is hard to define, and all of them have different leadership skills. I'll tell you what I have learned, and I have learned late in life, is that a good leader knows how to listen, knows how to earn the respect, knows how to bring together a group of diverse people with different opinions, different perspectives, and builds on that to move everybody forward. It's relatively easy to be a dictator. You just tell people what to do, and after a while they get numb to it, so they just do it. It's really hard to be a leader, because there's a quote in Gandhi where he's talking to the press and the people are streaming behind him, and he looks out there and he says, I gotta go. Those are my people, and they're walking away and leaving me. A real leader doesn't have to be out front. A real leader is looking out there and saying, they're gone. They're making it happen.
The premise of Envision South Carolina is that we are entering the digital age where there's a new set of requirements for success. You know, the agricultural age, you had to have labor, you had to have land, you had to have transportation for crops. Manufacturing, you had to have capital, you had to have machines, and you had to have markets. And the digital age, you got to have education, technology, and creativity. You know, so how does South Carolina become world-class again? I mean, in the agricultural age, colonial age, we were among the richest, most powerful, and well-respected in the world. How do we attain that position in the digital age? What do we need to focus on to get there?
You're right back to tactics. And I'll go back, I'm going to be redundant. South Carolina's not a state, it's a community, and it's a rather small one at that. You get this small crowd, and I'm not talking about 5 leaders, I'm talking about how many people do we have here? 3 million?
4 million.
4 million. That's not very many people. I mean, right. You got that sitting in one suburb in New York. Right. So you begin to communicate, you address the issue of the balance of power, you address the tax system, you address the educational system. But every time you do that, somebody's ox is going to get gored. And you're going to have to sit down with that ox and say, let's figure out a way that we can move this. This isn't going to be a revolution. This is a slow process, but we've got to have process. Let's figure out how we're not going to gore your ox to death. We're just going to get your ox a little bit richer if you'll share some of that ox with us. And we've got to have those dialogues instead of shouting at each other and building those barriers, those silos. If we continue to hide behind the silos, nobody's going to go anywhere.
We are often accused of being a parochial state.
What's wrong with
that? Well, in a parochial state,
yeah, let's define that.
Well, having a limited worldview, having less awareness and intelligent engagement of the world at large.
Well, I think that's good. I think the United States is
I have no question about it. The United States is, I think South Carolina is more than the South Carolina.
No, I
don't think so?
No, I don't think so. When you talk to, if you remember when you fly over Chicago and you look at those buildings along the waterfront, you think this is really wow. You fly out of Beijing and you see 40 miles of that. Right. And for us to say that that is a backward country, and you've seen the statistics where they've got more people speaking English than we've got people.
Right.
We have to recognize that the world is shifting, and if we want to remain as the dominant player, it takes a different set of skills. It doesn't take the skill of going in and bludgeoning somebody in the head. It figures out, how do we get them to invest in the South Carolina, invest in the U.S.? How do we take advantage of the skill bases they have so that we benefit from them? It's just a whole different approach. And if you say that we are not looking beyond ourselves, I think the whole country's guilty of that. Doesn't mean we're falling behind. It just means we're going to have to play a different game.
But this is a semantic difference. But I would argue that we are more insular, we are more inward looking as a state than the nation as a whole, but the nation
Right.
as a whole is that way as well. My question is,
but that's because you're here. I'll bet you if you go and have this conversation in Kansas, that Kansas looks at its naval just as much as we look at our naval.
You may be right. You may be right. Although
that's a begrudging.
Of course. Although I would argue there's some residual hostility, xenophobia, skepticism that comes from the Civil War era. I mean, that we're still, we still talk about them. I mean, it's still, New York is still the worst place on the world.
But we're perfectly prepared to have New York send some money down to us.
No question, no question.
I mean, that's because you feel that way because you come out of Charleston. Y'all still resent Greenville.
No, I'm from Greenville. I'm one of y'all, but that's a different thing. But how do we? You talked about a different set of skills in that global world.
Well, you're right on the digital age.
Yeah. How do we move South Carolina into that? Because if you accept the idea that the digital age really is, a hinge of history, it's an opportunity for a quantum leap.
Well, let's go back to business. If you grew up in Greenville in the 30s and 40s, you could go do work in a mill, manual labor, basically. Right. That. You could have a average high school education, and you could do fine. You could make enough money to raise a family, go on a picnic, do all that. You can't, first of all, you go work at BMW and Michelin, or you go work at Milligan, which is one of our stars and is home based here. Those skills that you had 20, 30, 40 years, they're totally useless. They aren't any good.
Right.
The education you got won't work today.
Right.
My premise is, we know that. That guy who is coming out of high school knows that. He is looking for a different track to run on. He is looking for that skill base. He is looking for that job. He knows that job is out there. And where we are letting him or her down is in our public education system. We are not preparing them to compete. They know that coming out. That's an issue we've got to address. So add that to the balance of power, and add that to a rework of the tax system. On the taxes, I don't think it's raising rates on the rich. What we need to be doing is a school teacher in Anderson, South Carolina should pay the same tax rate as the CEO of Milligan. That's all we're looking for. We're looking for quality, and then we could flush 90% of those pages.
Are you optimistic?
Yeah, I am, because of the Liberty Fellowship Program, and there are now 185 of them. I see new ones nominated every year, and they're just as bright, they're just as enthusiastic, they care just as much about the state as you and I did when we were young puppies, and I think they're going to get it done.
If you were King of South Carolina, King Hayne, you have
benevolent King Hayne.
Benevolent. Of course, you would always be benevolent. But if you were King Hayne and you could change one thing, what would you do? What would you change?
Well, I would quickly diffuse my 100% king power down to a lesser percentage. I wouldn't go below 50%. But I would certainly come down to 70 to 60, because then all of my subjects would say, I got a piece of the action. I want to play this game. I want to make a contribution. Yeah, I don't have to stand around and wait for King Hayne to give me my check. I can go out and I can build my business. I can educate my children. I can take my trip. I own part of it.
It's overcoming that hat in hand mentality that we as a state have had for so long.
Well, if you don't have the tools, you got to put your hat out there.
Right.
I mean, if we haven't given them the skill base, so that they don't have to put their hat out, what do you expect them to do? Envision, South Carolina, world class, globally connected.
History and culture. What are our assets and what are our liabilities in terms of living, dealing, being competitive in that new world?
Well, our assets are our people. Their positive attitude, their approach to life, their appreciation for where they are, the opportunities that they see. Our liabilities are mostly the creation of our own minds. There's some technical things that we need to deal with, but I don't think there's anything significantly holding us back.
You think our people are significantly, qualitatively different than Mississippi or Texas or California?
Well, those are three different, that's an apple and an orange and a banana. Yes, I do think, because South Carolina is not a
relatively small size with the ability to act quickly. Where have we done that? Where have we in South Carolina's history done that?
Well, you go back to the Education Improvement Act with Dick Riley.
Yeah.
That was quick. They would still be debating that in California. That never would have made it to the table in Texas and Mississippi. That was a game changer.
Why did that succeed? Why? I mean, Governor Riley, we're going to talk to him later today. I mean, he's very much an upstate product. Why was he able to do it? Why did it succeed?
Because I think there was communications across the state. All of the decision makers sat down and talked. And I don't mean the top 5 corporate chiefs. What about the good old days when we had leaders that could do something? And the leaders that were in power at that point made significant changes. But that isn't the way it is today. They were just not diverse in terms of race, certainly in terms of gender. It was a much smaller, less complicated state. The political power was centralized very tightly. And I think as we have moved into competition across the country and competition worldwide, we are adjusting to that. But it does take a different set of skills and a different approach.
What, within the context of South Carolina? Hi, I'm Phil Noble with Envision, South Carolina, and we're here in the University Center in Greenville talking with Hayne Hipp, one of the premier business leaders and civic leaders in this state, not only in his lifetime, but in his family, has been leaders throughout this state for years. Welcome, thank you for doing this.
Delighted to be here, Phil.
Talk a little bit about, as you were growing up, your sense of South Carolina as having a different identity, of being not just like every place else. What about South Carolina in your early years had an impact on you about us being different?
The state was significantly different than it is from now, and you'll hear people refer to state. It's really a community, and it's a relatively small one at that. We can reach decisions individually and collectively, and we can do something about them quickly, as opposed to time-consuming in California when you look at that size, or Mississippi with the liabilities they have on the educational front, on the racial front, just basically a poor economy. On Texas, which is split right down the middle between hardcore, rigid approaches on the liberal side, hardcore, rigid approaches on the conservative side. We're not burdened with those superficial distractions.
That's really interesting, the notion of linking our